that lived it.
Mm-hmm.
You may disagree with what he or she is talking about, but they were there
That's true.
when the events that they describe, and I hope that I can be useful
Of course.
to you in your program, but not. I'm not a perfectionist anymore at 102.
It's
So
okay.
my memory is what I would like for it to be. So forgive me for that
Oh no, it's okay.
possibility.
Hopefully, I live to 102. I'm trying to be as strong as you are. Uh, I got a long ways to go.
That's what I intend.
Nice. So we're gonna start off. Could you tell us your secret to longevity and good health?
Well, I don't know whether it's a secret or not, but when you're born, one day you realize that you're quite young and you would like to get older. And the people around you will help you think in that positive way, such as my mother and father, who didn't live to be 102, but they were older. And have the faith that tomorrow is going to be a better day, regardless to how negative today may be and even yesterday, and move forward with faith in the future as exemplified by your older relatives, that tomorrow can be a better day, and work to make that a better day. And day by day, one day you will look up and say, ooh, I didn't believe I was going to be wherever that late date is. But you will meet that date if you have had faith in the future as exemplified by your ancestors. You will feel a sense of challenge and satisfaction at the world that you have had to live in. That's part of the explanation. Of course, it is good if you have the physical, biological background to help you do that. But the faith in the future and the demand for you to help make that future a better, a better place in which to live that future gives you the challenge then to participate not only in your own future, but the future of others. And therefore, you have an obligation to keep on keeping on.
So
Does
awesome.
that help?
It does. It helps a lot. So if you could describe yourself in one word, what would that be?
Well, I would say that um, my early life uh, encouraged in a positive way by my great mother and father and other relatives and friends that lived in the same neighborhood. You see, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, December the 7th, 1918. But the humorous story goes this way, but the facts are that one day when I was 8 months old, I looked around and saw how people of my color were being treated. And I said to my mama, Mama, I'm leaving here. And Mama said to Daddy, this boy is going to leave here and he doesn't even know how to change his diapers. I'm going with him. So in I think October of 1919, my family brought me, my brother and sister to Chicago, with my father being part of that because he was such a family person that he was not going to let his about him. But he brought with him the attitude and the skills to live in Chicago biologically and physically and economically. The same life that he had lived in Birmingham with more protection. You see, my mother was glad to get my father out of Alabama because he was, despite his lack of education, he was an activist supported by some white friends. One by the name of Hugo Black, who became, which I get my slave name, who later became a justice in the Supreme Court. But that protected my father, who had the courage to go and vote, but he was protected by this Hugo Black protection. By the way, Hugo Black had been a Ku Klux Klansman. That is another story about behavior and looking. And so my mother was glad for him, my father, as exemplified all over the South, in the urban areas of the South at that time. During and after World War I, to come to a place where they could make a living and be able to vote without fear, to be able to, to send their children to school and educate them for the complicated world that they knew was coming for them, and to be friends with one another. And so that was the environment which my family came to in Chicago. It was a segregated, racially segregated town, but the Blacks who had fled the South in that period, roughly from 1914 to the end of World War II, were friends with one another because many of them had known, most of them were urban dwellers in the South, segregated, and therefore friendly with one another. That's a short story of my leaving the South, coming to the North, and particularly Chicago. If some of your listeners or viewers would like to learn more from others, they could buy a 2-volume book that volume called Bridges of Memory, Oral History of 3 Generations, awesome, whose families came to Chicago in that period that I'm describing. Right. And a personal oral history, brief but accurate, that I have finished a little while ago, called Sacred Ground, which is a story of my story of growing up on the South Side of Chicago. And I give it that label because for me and my generation, that area for us was sacred ground.
That's amazing. So, if you could say what the best decade of your lifetime has been, either in Chicago or elsewhere, what would that be?
Well, it depends on the decade. Uh, I think after I returned from World War II, and that's another story, that I saw progress in the racial area. And I had the opportunity to meet a gentleman in Montgomery, Alabama, who became world famous, but his name was Dr. Martin Luther King. And I saw him exemplifying the leadership and giving those who knew him an inspiration and an obligation to move forward to make this world a better, starting with the small town, well, big for south of Montgomery, Alabama, and bringing that message to big cities like Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit. He exemplified the possible in the changes that he was able to make. And that after World War II gave me a obligation to follow the legacy of this phenomenal, great, and brilliant man who sacrificed himself because he was a universalist, not just Black, but using race as an example of the changes that were necessary and possible.
Yes. So, if you could give any advice to your younger self, what would that be?
I would advise them to go to their earlier, older relatives and ask the simple question, what was it like when you were my age? And listen to that. This crosses race lines, but certainly dramatized by race lines. By the faith, you see, I can tell the story that my grandparents had been slaves, drugged from the South. They didn't drug from Africa. They didn't volunteer. I only met one of them, my mother's mother, who was a younger woman. My mother brought her to Chicago to live out her lasting year. And she told the story of her young years as slave. And yet she was optimistic about the future of her grandchildren, my brother, my sister, myself. And like my mother and father, demanded that I be a good student when I was in my early years, kindergarten. I remember so well, Grandma would ask every day, what you do in school today, boy, in her language. And I would, in my early English, try to explain to grandma that I was doing. My brother was an example of doing the right thing all the time. And one day I must have been playing with matches. I was in kindergarten. That's before the first year of education. And grandma said, when boy, in her her southern dialect, boy, what you doing? And I tried to explain in my childish way that I wasn't doing it. And grandma said something that I have never forgotten, even though that was in my infant years. Boy, I can't hear what you're saying because what you're doing talk so loud. Actions speak louder than words. I carry that message. I cannot hear what you are saying because what you are doing talk so loud. And she passed very soon after that. But I remember grandma and her legacy of having survived slavery and other negatives, looked at her grandchildren as being examples of her efforts to make change. And then, because in her last years, she still carried that positive attitude, my brother and I were inspired to move forward. We had a debt. So I would advise younger people, regardless to race and regardless to any of the differences, to listen to their older relatives, and then move forward because of that advice and obligation to the past, but also to themselves and the future. That was one example. And my mother and father, despite the fact that they had been deprived of education, insisted that my brother and sister and I get education to be prepared, the optimism that they had, be ready, the future is coming, be ready to move forward. And that means that you need a good education so that you can be prepared for that future. So that was a kind of family and community, because in the first migration, what I have said was part of their culture. In fact, the mother's grandmother would brag about how their children were doing in school, brag with one another. And so we felt an obligation to do the best we could so that mama and older relatives could be in that braggadocio community. So in the segregation, we accumulated a feeling of obligation and prepared ourselves for the future. Now, I didn't go any further than almost a doctorate at the University of Chicago. My brother became a prominent lawyer. But we are examples of doing the impossible, making that impossible, that when we analyze the community, possible. and being able to therefore move back and give something to the future. And Dr. King's ancestry, his father, mother, grandma, exemplifies what can happen if, I'm not speaking of his death, the violence caused him to leave, but even the night before his assassination, Dr. King said, I've been to the mountaintop. I may not get there, but you shall surely get there. And it's sung earlier in Washington, D.C. at the March on Washington. We shall overcome. So all of those things that I'm trying to insert into our conversation were part of my environment. And I felt and feel an obligation to tell those stories to younger people so that they can see that the future is in their hands, feel an obligation. And examples of that, of course, are the first things politically dramatized by the Black president, first Black president of the United States. But we have other firsts, but that politically exemplified doing the impossible. Who would have thought that a man of color or a woman of color would be that far? The door opened, they were ready, prepared to walk in.
That's amazing.
So I say to young people, keep the faith. We shall overcome. And I feel an obligation to share my personal history with all people, but focusing particularly on people of color.
We appreciate that. So you talked a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a little bit about your relatives that inspired you. So if you could say somebody else who influenced you the most, who would that be in your life?
What was that again?
So if you could say who else influenced you in your life, you talked a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and your relatives and a little bit about their history. So if you can name one more person, who would that person be that influences you?
Well, there were other people. Paul Robeson, W.C. Handy, father of the blues, by the way. Uh, Duke Ellington, who who I introduced, by the way, to Dr. King. They knew each other by stories, but I had the opportunity at McCormick Place to introduce Dr. King to Edward Ellington, Duke Ellington. They were on examples. Duke Ellington at a segregated performance on the north side, just before uh, I was inducted into World War II. I went over to that entertainment center, and they didn't want us blacks. There were three of us, four of us, in fact. They didn't want us in there, though. And Duke Ellington said, and I'm cutting it short, when one of his performers told him that we were being segregated, that he said it publicly, these are my guests, and if my guests can enjoy my performance, this performance is over. Immediately, we were entered into. And so what I'm trying to say, there are examples at the top level of people who have succeeded because their ancestors paved the way and they were prepared, of how change can come. And I mentioned Dr. King and Duke Ellington, but before them, there were the Paul Robesons and the females that I'm trying to remember names of color, who could have been secure economically, but they felt an obligation and they transferred that attitude and those legacies to those of us who don't make the news that big, but feel they have an obligation. And one of the things that my daddy said to my mama one day, that's a very interesting story. He said, Maddie, pay the rent, get plenty of food, and then he laughingly said, and get plenty of toilet paper. My daddy was a Garveyite, Marcus Garvey, that you may have heard or read about, who was, and if you have those three things, you may get more, much more. And all of those people that I've spoken about had more, but they felt an obligation as Frederick Douglass, advisor, but the ex-slave advisor to Abraham Lincoln, said when the Union Army was losing the war to the Confederates, he said to Lincoln, and Lincoln could have bought him and tried to. That's a story that, but Lincoln was liberal. And he said to Lincoln, free the slaves and win the war. He had been offered a lot of opportunities to shut up and talk, as Dr. King later was. But he felt an obligation. And Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And the young slave, ex-slave men came into battle. And the Union Army helped to win the Civil War. 17 of them received the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is high. And so, moving to the present, we have that history in and I say to young people, young and regardless to race, when you go shopping, what do you go looking for? And they will fumble around all kinds. And eventually one of them would say, Mr. Black, when I go shopping, I look for the best I can find, the cheapest price. What do you think the slavers did when they went to Africa? They were selective and selected the cream of the crop to the African-American children. I said, see, you come from the cream of the crop. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you are inferior. You come from the cream of the crop. And that humorizes, but makes them feel confident that they have an obligation and therefore they must be prepared. And the success figures, like Carol Moser Braun, the first Black woman U.S. Senator, and others, and certainly Barack Obama fulfills. We have multi-millionaire success people, and I could name a few, but they felt an obligation. And so in the Black Belt in Chicago, we were, because we came with the same mission, we fled the South, fled to be able to fight back more successfully, to be able to vote. And in that period, blacks outvoted immigrant whites on a big basis and elected, and felt the importance of being prepared and the confidence that the door was going to open. That didn't mean necessarily that you would be the entering figure, but you had an obligation to help open the door.
Yeah.
And others like you could be able to walk in. And Barack Obama and his wife, Michelle, and other successful people. And so I feel obligated to, even at 102, to talk with younger people to let them know that they're looking at a person who did overcome some of the difficulties, but feel that he has an obligation to share that experience and that history with others so that they will feel an obligation as well as feel the competence to move on and make this a better world. Now, today is more important because once upon a time when my unit was getting ready after we had been through the battles of Europe in World War II, to go to Japan or the East, where we had troops, and I heard that we had dropped a missile called the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Later, I had the opportunity to see that. And I said, I wish we had gone over. Then I said, there's no monopoly on intelligence. And if you have intelligence, you get knowledge. And if you have knowledge, you can use it any way you wish. Now there are at least 4 or 5 more big countries where they have atomic nuclear weapons that are far superior to that which was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And so I feel an obligation, even in the short time left, to say this is one world, and we have to help everyone to understand an obligation if they are going to survive with hunger and housing and all. They have an obligation to help others get those necessities and cross the border, because we all are human beings, regardless to race, gender, and all of those. And I'm proud that many young people understand that and have demonstrated to break the barrier. Why does race matter? When many of us on the standards that the dominant group have put forward, we have passed those. And the Army was just one example. Passed those, and yet we are based. Why does race matter then? If we can run faster, if we can shoot better, if we can do all the things better than most of the dominant group, why does race matter? There is a reason. And if it wasn't race, there would be other factors. And so we have to help younger people in this new world where the atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is obsolete now, to understand that their future depends on their behavior in the present that is inclusive rather than exclusive. Now, people like Dr. King, others taking the leadership, understood it, but set an example. If people like Tim Black that makes that group who has succeeded somewhat feel obligated to others. And that is the story of my life and the obligation that I have felt throughout, and had people like my younger wife to feel that she had to help also in making these changes. And many of my former students, I'm so proud that students that I had 50, 60 years ago, when they heard I had a birthday, have sent me cards and called my phone, and fortunately have young people like your operation and you to help pass this legacy on. And I hope that I haven't talked too much,
Oh no,
but
you're
it's
okay.
be useful.
No, it's okay. I appreciate it.
Is it?
And then I had another question for you. So
Go ahead.
if you had a soundtrack for your life, what would that song be? So if you had like background music during your lifetime, what song has inspired you, or would be a representation of your life and your struggles and accomplishments?
You say what? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Pardon my.
It's
Pardon my. Go ahead.
So if you had a soundtrack of your life, what song would be playing in the background that helps describe your triumphs and some of your struggles?
I think the song that we sang so often uh, inspired me, and very often, we shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. That song, with its brevity and its clarity, has been in my head, in my thoughts, ever since I first heard it in Washington, D.C., in the March on Washington. Don't sing it every time, but I hear it in my heart and mind as we move forward, even with the negative things that have come into my life and the life of others. I carry that song and that faith that we shall overcome. And so I hope that others can share the the not the necessarily the melody line, but the line, maybe the melody line, and the faith in the future as their ancestors sang. I'm so glad that trouble don't last always. Oh my Lord, oh my Lord, what can I do? And carrying the feeling that they had the obligation, they could, and then the message, we shall overcome one day, and take that one day at a time. Go to bed and get a good night's sleep. Get up with something to do that day. And one day they will look up and say, ooh, I didn't believe it. They will be 102.
That's truly a blessing. And I appreciate you sharing that with us. So, if there was one last piece of advice or one quote that comes to mind that you could give any future generation or people that may potentially listen to this, what would that be?
Yeah.
So, if you could give us one quote or one piece of advice you would give the future generation, what would that be?
Faith, hope, faith, and preparation for the future. Believe that the future is going to come as it is. Believe that they can make that future better for themselves and others. And be prepared academically, socially, that is inclusive of other people as we had to learn to do, and then keep on keeping on with that positive attitude, which deals with human beings handling the new technology that is part of this current generation. That the technology is only to be used, can only be used by human beings making the decision on how it is to be used. And their safety and their future is dependent on how the new world that they live in should be managed in an inclusive rather than inclusive way.
That's amazing. And on behalf of myself and the museum, and especially on behalf of myself, I appreciate you doing this work and being that role model that helps steps those standards and gives young people like myself somebody to believe in, or a way to live my life and inspire others, because we ideally tell these stories through each other, and then you live through all of us. So the fact that you're doing this work and you share those experiences, and even this moment that you're sharing with me today means a lot, and I really appreciate it.
I am honored to have had the opportunity, and I hope that our conversation has been beneficial to the viewers and the listeners, to stimulate them to think about their future and what they want the neighborhood, what do they want the city, the country to be like, but to take one step at a time, one day at a time, so that they will have the energy and be prepared and optimistic, using examples like Obama and others, that the future is in their hands. Be prepared. The door is going to open. Be optimistic about that and make this a better world.
Thank you so much.